Eleanor Whitmore sat perfectly still in her black mourning dress, her pale hands folded delicately in her lap as the photographer adjusted his lens one final time. The year was 1899, and widows' portraits were a solemn tradition in the small New England town of Millbrook. But what emerged from that darkroom would haunt researchers for over a century, and when modern technology finally revealed the truth hidden in those faded sepia tones, it would shake the very foundations of local cough. History. The lace handkerchief she appeared to clutch wasn't fabric at all, and the secret Eleanor carried to her grave was about to be exposed in the most chilling way imaginable. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The autumn wind rattled the windows of Jeremiah Blackwood's photography studio as Eleanor Whitmore stepped through the heavy oak door, her black silk dress rustling against the hardwood floors. The scent of developing chemicals hung thick in the air, mixing with the mustiness of old velvet drapes and the lingering tobacco smoke from Blackwood's pipe. Eleanor's face was a mask of composed grief, her dark eyes reflecting the weight of recent loss as she surveyed the cramped studio with its elaborate Victorian furnishings and ornate backdrop screens. Blackwood, a thin man with silver-streaked hair and ink-stained fingers, emerged from behind his camera with practiced efficiency. He had photographed dozens of grieving widows in his 30-year career, each one a study in contained sorrow and social propriety. The ritual was always the same. Formal pose, hands folded, expression solemn yet dignified. These portraits served as final tributes to departed husbands and lasting mementos for surviving family members. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said with a respectful nod, "please accept my condolences on the loss of your husband." The whole town was shocked by Cornelius's sudden passing. His voice carried the practiced sympathy of a man who had consoled countless bereaved clients, yet there was genuine warmth in his weathered features as he guided her toward the ornate chair positioned before his camera. Eleanor's response was barely above a whisper, her gloved hands trembling slightly as she arranged her skirts. "Thank you, Mr. Blackwood. Cornelius would have wanted a proper portrait to commemorate our years together." Her voice carried the refined accent of Boston society, marking her as one of the few educated women in this rural Massachusetts town. She had arrived in Millbrook 5 years earlier as a young bride, bringing with her an air of sophisticated mystery that the local gossips had never quite penetrated. The photographer busied himself with his equipment, adjusting the heavy brass fittings and checking the glass plates that would capture Eleanor's image for posterity. His assistant, a nervous young man named Timothy Marsh, shuffled about arranging the backdrop and ensuring the gas lamps provided adequate illumination. The process was methodical and time-consuming, requiring patience from both photographer and subject as each detail was carefully considered. "The light is perfect this afternoon," Blackwood observed, squinting through his lens at Eleanor's pale complexion. "The northern exposure gives us that soft, even illumination that works so beautifully for memorial portraits. Now, if you would kindly position your hands in your lap, just so." He gestured with practiced authority, having learned through experience that proper hand placement was crucial to the overall composition. Eleanor's fingers moved with deliberate precision, her left hand settling into position, while her right hand remained perfectly still. There was something almost ritualistic about the way she arranged herself, as if this moment held deeper significance than a simple photographic session. Her dark eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the camera, and for a moment, Blackwood wondered what memories occupied her thoughts during these quiet preparations. The brass clock on the studio wall ticked steadily as Blackwood made his final adjustments, the sound seeming to echo the rhythm of Eleanor's breathing. Outside, the October sky was beginning to darken with the promise of an early winter, and the gas lamps cast dancing shadows across the studio walls. The atmosphere was thick with unspoken emotion, the kind of weighted silence that often accompanied moments of great significance. "Mrs. Whitmore," Blackwood said gently, "I notice you're holding what appears to be a handkerchief. Is this a memento of some particular importance?" His professional curiosity was genuine, as he had learned that understanding the personal significance of objects in portraits often helped him capture more meaningful images. Many widows chose to include prayer books, jewelry, or other items that held special connection to their departed husbands. Eleanor's gaze flickered downward to her left hand, and for just an instant, something resembling surprise crossed her features before being quickly suppressed. "Yes," she replied after a moment's hesitation. "It belonged to my dear Cornelius. I find great comfort in holding it during these difficult times." Her explanation was delivered with such practiced smoothness that Blackwood had no reason to question its veracity, though he couldn't help noticing the slight tremor in her voice. The photographer nodded understandingly and returned to his preparations, unaware that he was about to create one of the most enigmatic and disturbing images in the history of American photography. His experienced eyes saw only a grieving widow clutching a sentimental token, maintaining the composure expected of a woman of her social standing. The truth was far more complex and infinitely more chilling than anything his Victorian sensibilities could have imagined. "Please remain absolutely still," Blackwood instructed as he prepared to remove the lens cap. "The exposure will take approximately 30 seconds, so any movement will result in blurring." His voice carried the authority of years of experience, and Eleanor responded with a barely perceptible nod, her entire body seeming to solidify into perfect stillness. The moment the exposure began, an unusual quiet settled over the studio, as if the very air had become dense and expectant. Even Timothy, normally fidgety and prone to nervous chatter, stood motionless in the corner, unconsciously holding his breath as the seconds ticked by. The gas flames flickered slightly, casting shifting patterns of light and shadow across Eleanor's pale face, but she remained as immobile as a marble statue. During those 30 seconds, Blackwood found himself studying his subject with professional interest, noting the fine bone structure of her face and the way the mourning dress emphasized her slender figure. Eleanor Whitmore was undoubtedly a beautiful woman, though her beauty was of the severe aristocratic variety that commanded respect rather than casual admiration. Her dark hair was pulled back in the severe style favored by widows, and her pale skin seemed almost luminous against the black silk of her dress. What struck him most profoundly was the intensity of her gaze, which seemed to penetrate beyond the physical boundaries of the studio and focus on something invisible to everyone else in the room. There was a depth of feeling in those dark eyes that spoke of experiences far beyond simple grief, though Blackwood attributed this to the natural response of a woman who had lost her life's companion at such a relatively young age. When the exposure was complete, Eleanor seemed to exhale for the first time in minutes, her rigid posture relaxing slightly as she blinked and refocused on her immediate surroundings. The spell of absolute stillness was broken, and the normal sounds of the studio, the ticking clock, the hiss of gas flames, the distant street noises, seemed to rush back with startling clarity. "That should produce an excellent image," Blackwood assured her as he replaced the lens cap and began the process of removing the exposed glass plate. "The lighting was perfect, and you maintained wonderful composure throughout the exposure. I should have the finished portrait ready for collection within the week." Eleanor rose from the chair with fluid grace, smoothing her skirts and adjusting her black lace gloves. "Thank you, Mr. Blackwood. I'm certain it will serve as an appropriate memorial." Her voice had regained its earlier steadiness, though there was something in her manner that suggested relief at having completed the session. She moved toward the door with purposeful steps, as if eager to escape the confines of the studio and return to the privacy of her own thoughts. As she reached for the door handle, Blackwood called out with professional courtesy, "Mrs. Whitmore, will there be any other family members who might wish to have copies made? I know it's common for relatives to request additional prints of memorial portraits." Eleanor paused with her hand on the brass handle, her back still turned to the photographer. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a strange quality that Blackwood would remember for years afterward, though he could never quite articulate what made it so unsettling. "No, Mr. Blackwood, there are no other family members. The portrait will be for my own keeping exclusively." The door closed behind her with a soft click, leaving Blackwood and his assistant alone in the studio with the lingering scent of Eleanor's lavender perfume and an inexplicable sense of unease that neither man could fully explain. Timothy was the first to break the silence, his young voice betraying a nervousness that seemed disproportionate to the simple photography session they had just completed. "There was something strange about that lady," Timothy ventured, busying himself with cleaning the camera equipment to avoid meeting his employer's gaze. "The way she held that handkerchief, like it was something alive that might try to escape if she loosened her grip. Blackwood frowned, considering his assistant's observation with the analytical mind that had served him well throughout his photographic career. Grief affects people in different ways, Timothy. Mrs. Whitmore has suffered a terrible loss, and we must not judge her response too harshly. Yet even as he spoke these reasonable words, he could not entirely dismiss the strange atmosphere that had pervaded the session. Over the following days, as Blackwood developed the glass plate in his darkroom, he found himself returning again and again to study Eleanor's image with growing fascination. The technical quality of the photograph was excellent, with sharp detail and perfect contrast that showcased his skill as a photographer. Eleanor's face was captured with haunting clarity, every line of grief etched into her refined features with almost painful precision. But it was her left hand that drew his attention repeatedly, though he could not initially articulate why. The object she clutched appeared to be folded fabric, presumably the handkerchief she had mentioned. Yet there was something about its texture and the way it caught the light that seemed somehow wrong. The shadows within the folds created patterns that suggested shapes more complex than simple fabric should produce. Blackwood attributed these observations to the natural human tendency to see faces and familiar forms in random patterns, a phenomenon he had noticed in clouds, wood grain, and rock formations throughout his life. The developing chemicals sometimes created unusual effects in photographs, and the interplay of light and shadow could produce unexpected results even for experienced photographers. When Eleanor arrived to collect her portrait the following week, she examined it with the same intense scrutiny that had characterized her studio session. Her pale fingers traced the outline of her own image through the protective glass, lingering over her hands with particular attention. Blackwood watched her reaction carefully, hoping for some sign of satisfaction or approval that would confirm the portrait's success as a memorial tribute. "It captures the moment perfectly," Eleanor finally pronounced, though her tone lacked the warmth typically associated with pleased clients. "You have a remarkable talent, Mr. Blackwood. This image will serve its purpose admirably." The photographer accepted her payment and carefully wrapped the framed portrait in brown paper, securing it with string for transport to Eleanor's home on Elm Street. As she departed with the package under her arm, Blackwood felt a curious sense of completion, as if a chapter in some larger story had been concluded. He had no way of knowing that the portrait would outlive both photographer and subject, or that future technology would reveal secrets hidden within its sepia tones. Eleanor Whitmore's life in Millbrook following her husband's death was marked by increasing reclusiveness and growing eccentricity that gradually isolated her from the small community she had never fully joined. Neighbors reported seeing her walking in her garden at odd hours, always dressed in black, often appearing to carry on conversations with invisible companions. The local pastor, Reverend Jonathan Hardwell, made several unsuccessful attempts to provide spiritual comfort, but Eleanor politely declined his visits with the same gracious remoteness that characterized all her social interactions. The years passed with remarkable consistency in Eleanor's routine, each day following the same pattern of solitary walks, quiet contemplation, and careful maintenance of her household without the assistance of servants or companions. Visitors became increasingly rare, and those who did venture to call often reported feeling unwelcome, despite Eleanor's unfailing politeness. She seemed to exist in a state of suspended animation, as if time had stopped for her on the day of Cornelius's death. Dr. Marcus Fielding, the town's elderly physician, occasionally encountered Eleanor during his rounds and noted with professional concern the gradual changes in her appearance and demeanor. Her already pale complexion grew increasingly translucent, and her eyes developed a distant quality that suggested preoccupation with matters far removed from the everyday concerns of small-town life. When he offered medical assistance, Eleanor assured him with quiet confidence that she was in perfect health and required no professional intervention. The portrait, meanwhile, occupied a place of honor in Eleanor's front parlor, positioned on the mantelpiece where it could be viewed from every angle in the room. Visitors who were admitted to the house invariably commented on the striking image, noting how perfectly it captured Eleanor's aristocratic bearing and the profound grief that had shaped her life since becoming a widow. None suspected that the woman in the photograph harbored secrets that would have shocked their Victorian sensibilities. Local gossips, deprived of concrete information about Eleanor's private life, created elaborate theories to explain her eccentric behavior and solitary existence. Some suggested she was conducting correspondence with relatives in distant cities. Others proposed that she was slowly disposing of family wealth through mysterious investments or charitable donations. The most romantic among them whispered that she was waiting for a lost love to return from travels abroad, though no evidence supported such speculation. Mrs. Abigail Thornton, Eleanor's nearest neighbor and the unofficial chronicler of neighborhood activities, kept detailed notes about the widow's daily routine with the dedication of a naturalist studying rare birds. She observed Eleanor's morning walks through the garden, her afternoon sessions of reading by the front window, and her evening habit of standing motionless before the portrait for extended periods. These observations were shared with other interested parties during afternoon tea gatherings, where Eleanor's behavior was analyzed with the intensity typically reserved for international political developments. As 1899 gave way to 1900, Eleanor's isolation became so complete that weeks might pass without anyone catching sight of her distinctive figure in its perpetual mourning attire. Dr. Fielding grew sufficiently concerned to make an unannounced house call, but Eleanor received him with such composed dignity that his worries seemed foolish and intrusive. She served tea with perfect hospitality, discussed current events with informed intelligence, and thanked him graciously for his professional concern, while making it clear that his services were unnecessary. The new century brought subtle changes to Millbrook, as modern conveniences and ideas gradually infiltrated the conservative New England community, but Eleanor remained insulated from these developments by choice and circumstance. Her house became a kind of temporal island where Victorian customs and attitudes were preserved like specimens in amber, unchanged by the passage of time or the evolution of social norms. Young people in town began to regard Eleanor's house with the mixture of curiosity and apprehension typically reserved for supposedly haunted locations, though no specific supernatural incidents had been reported. Children dared each other to approach her front gate after dark, but few possessed sufficient courage to complete such challenges. The combination of Eleanor's austere appearance, her mysterious past, and her profound isolation had transformed her into a figure of local legend. Mrs. Thornton's observations during this period became increasingly detailed and somewhat disturbing, though she attributed unusual incidents to her own imagination rather than supernatural causes. She reported seeing lights moving through Eleanor's house at unusual hours, hearing faint sounds that might have been crying or singing, and observing Eleanor engaged in animated conversations in rooms where no other person could be detected. These accounts were dismissed by more skeptical neighbors as the product of an overactive imagination combined with excessive curiosity. The portrait during this time seemed to exert an increasingly powerful influence over Eleanor's daily routine, with Mrs. Thornton noting that the widow spent progressively longer periods standing before the image in what appeared to be silent communion or meditation. On several occasions, neighbors reported seeing Eleanor speaking directly to the portrait, her lips moving in animated conversation, though no words could be distinguished from outside the house. Dr. Fielding's final visit to Eleanor occurred in the spring of 1902, when concerns about her welfare reached a level that demanded professional investigation. He found her seated in her parlor, with the portrait positioned for optimal viewing, her hands folded in exactly the same position as the photographed image. The resemblance between the living woman and her photographic representation had become so precise that for a moment the doctor experienced the disorienting sensation of seeing double. Eleanor's response to his inquiries about her health was delivered with characteristic precision and courtesy, but Dr. Fielding noted subtle changes in her speech patterns and thought processes that suggested possible mental deterioration. Her answers were perfectly logical, yet somehow disconnected from the questions being asked, as if she was responding to an entirely different conversation occurring simultaneously in her mind. When the doctor tentatively suggested that Eleanor might benefit from the companionship of a live-in housekeeper or the regular visits of a church lady, her rejection was swift and absolute. She explained with calm authority that she required no assistance in managing her affairs, and that additional company would interfere with important work she needed to complete. The nature of this work remained deliberately vague despite Dr. Fielding's gentle attempts to elicit more specific information. As he prepared to leave, Dr. Fielding found his attention drawn irresistibly to the portrait on the mantelpiece, though he could not identify what made it so compelling. The image seemed somehow more vivid and lifelike than typical photographs of the period, as if Eleanor's grief had been transformed into a tangible presence that emanated from the sepia tones with unsettling intensity. "That's a remarkable portrait," he commented, hoping to draw Eleanor into more conventional conversation. "Blackwood certainly captured your likeness with extraordinary skill." Eleanor's response was delivered with an intensity that startled the elderly physician, her dark eyes blazing with sudden animation as she rose from her chair and moved toward the mantelpiece with swift, purposeful steps. "Yes, he captured exactly what needed to be preserved," she said, her voice carrying undertones that Dr. Fielding found impossible to interpret. "Every detail is perfect, every shadow precisely where it should be." The doctor left Eleanor's house with a profound sense of unease that lingered for days afterward, though he could not articulate the source of his discomfort. His medical training had taught him to recognize signs of mental disturbance, but Eleanor's condition seemed to transcend conventional categories of psychological ailment. She appeared to be existing in a state of heightened awareness that encompassed realities invisible to everyone else around her. Eleanor's death in the winter of 1903 came without warning or apparent cause, discovered by Mrs. Thornton when 3 days passed without any sign of activity in the house next door. The local constable, accompanied by Dr. Fielding, found Eleanor seated in her parlor chair facing the portrait, her hands folded in the familiar pose, her expression peaceful and composed. There were no signs of struggle or illness, no evidence of suicide or foul play, nothing to suggest any cause of death beyond the simple cessation of life. Dr. Fielding's examination revealed a woman who appeared to have died in perfect health, as if she had simply chosen to stop living in a moment of her own selection. Her body showed no signs of aging beyond what would be expected for a woman in her mid-30s, and her peaceful expression suggested that death had come as a welcome release rather than an unwelcome intrusion. The funeral arrangements proceeded according to Eleanor's detailed written instructions, discovered in a sealed envelope on her writing desk, along with legal documents disposing of her modest estate. She had requested the simplest possible burial service, with no eulogy or extended ceremony, to be conducted by whatever clergyman was available, regardless of denominational affiliation. Her instructions regarding the disposition of personal possessions were equally straightforward, with most items to be sold at auction and proceeds donated to the local orphanage. The portrait, however, was to be given to the newly established Millbrook Historical Society, with the specification that it be displayed as a representative example of late 19th century memorial photography. Eleanor's written instructions emphasized that the portrait should be preserved exactly as created, with no restoration or alteration permitted under any circumstances. She seemed to anticipate that future generations might discover significance in the image that was invisible to contemporary viewers. Reverend Hardwell conducted Eleanor's burial service on a gray December morning, with only a handful of townspeople in attendance, most motivated by curiosity rather than genuine mourning. The widow, who had lived so privately, died equally privately, leaving behind more questions than answers about her mysterious life and enigmatic personality. Her grave marker bore only her name and dates of birth and death, with no sentimental inscription or religious reference to provide insight into her beliefs or values. The Millbrook Historical Society gratefully accepted Eleanor's portrait, along with several other items from her estate, recognizing the image as an excellent example of period photography that would help future visitors understand life in the town during the 1890s. The Society's first president, banker William Carpenter, arranged for the portrait to be displayed in their main exhibition room, alongside other artifacts from the community's Victorian era. For nearly 70 years, Eleanor's portrait hung undisturbed in the Historical Society's modest building, viewed by thousands of visitors who saw only a beautifully composed photograph of a grieving widow from the previous century. School children on educational tours learned about Victorian mourning customs while studying Eleanor's severe black dress and formal pose. Teachers explaining how photography served important social functions during an era when visual records were rare and precious. Local historians occasionally referenced Eleanor's portrait in articles about 19th century life in Millbrook, noting how perfectly it embodied the social expectations and emotional restraint that, quote, characterized the period. Art students from nearby colleges sometimes visited to study Jeremiah Blackwood's photographic techniques, admiring his use of lighting and composition to create psychologically compelling images that, combre, transcended mere documentation. The portrait's transformation from ordinary historical artifact to objective mysterious fascination began in 1971 when the Historical Society received a substantial grant to modernize their facilities and create digital archives of their photographic collection. Dr. Catherine Reynolds, a young historian specializing in 19th-century American social customs, was hired to oversee the digitization project and catalog the Society's extensive collection of period photographs. Dr. Reynolds approached the task with scholarly enthusiasm, recognizing the unique opportunity to preserve important historical documents while making them accessible to researchers worldwide through emerging computer technologies. Her background in art history had trained her to notice subtle details in visual materials that less experienced observers might overlook, a skill that would prove crucial in unlocking Eleanor's long-hidden secret. The process of digitizing Eleanor's portrait required multiple high-resolution scans to capture every nuance of tone and texture in the original photograph, a painstaking procedure that took several hours to complete properly. Dr. Reynolds supervised each step personally, ensuring that the digital reproduction would preserve all the information contained in Blackwood's original glass plate negative. As the first digital images appeared on her computer monitor, Dr. Reynolds found herself drawn into the same fascination that had captivated viewers for decades. Though she initially attributed her intense interest to professional appreciation for exceptional photographic artistry, Eleanor's face seemed to emerge from the screen with startling immediacy, her dark eyes conveying depths of emotion that transcended the limitations of sepia-toned photography. It was during the final high-resolution scan that Dr. Reynolds first noticed something unusual about Eleanor's left hand, though the discovery came gradually rather than as a sudden revelation. The computer's ability to magnify specific portions of the image while maintaining clarity allowed her to examine details that had been invisible or ambiguous in the original photograph, revealing information that Blackwood himself had never suspected. The fabric Eleanor appeared to be clutching, resolved into patterns far more complex than simple textile could produce when viewed at maximum magnification and contrast enhancement. Dr. Reynolds found herself adjusting brightness levels and sharpening filters in an attempt to clarify what she was seeing, her academic curiosity overriding any consideration of the disturbing subtle implications of her discoveries. What emerged from the digital analysis was so shocking that Dr. Reynolds initially assumed she was witnessing some kind of technical artifact produced by the scanning equipment or computer processing algorithms. The shapes within Eleanor's grasp, when viewed with sufficient magnification and proper contrast adjustment, suggested features that belonged to no inanimate object she could identify. The young historian spent 3 days reviewing and re-reviewing her digital scans, consulting technical manuals, and seeking advice from computer specialists to rule out mechanical explanations for what appeared in the enhanced images. Every technical consultation confirmed that the scanning equipment was functioning properly, and that no artificial distortions had been introduced during the digitization process. Dr. Reynolds's breakthrough came when she printed enlarged sections of Eleanor's left hand using the highest quality photographic paper available, allowing her to study the details with magnifying glasses under optimal lighting conditions. The physical prints eliminated any possibility that computer screen limitations or digital processing errors were responsible for the disturbing shapes she had been observing. What she saw in those enlarged prints challenged everything she thought she knew about Eleanor Whitmore and raised questions that extended far beyond academic historical research. The folds of fabric in Eleanor's grasp, when viewed with sufficient magnification, revealed unmistakable anatomical features that belonged to no handkerchief or memorial token that any Victorian widow might reasonably possess. The shapes embedded within those mysterious folds suggested the preserved remains of something far more precious and infinitely more tragic than any textile keepsake. Something that explained Eleanor's profound grief, her subsequent reclusiveness, and her strange obsession with the portrait that had captured her secret for posterity. Dr. Reynolds realized she was looking at evidence of a loss so devastating that Eleanor had chosen to carry its physical manifestation with her even during the formal photography session that was meant to commemorate, quote, her husband's death. The implications of this discovery were staggering from both historical and human perspectives, suggesting that Eleanor's public grief for her husband had masked a private sorrow far more profound and socially unacceptable. Victorian society's rigid moral codes and medical limitations would have provided no acceptable outlet for the kind of loss that Eleanor appeared to have suffered, forcing her to grieve in absolute isolation while maintaining a facade of conventional widowhood. Dr. Reynolds spent sleepless nights researching 19th-century medical practices, infant mortality statistics, and social customs surrounding pregnancy loss, seeking historical context that might explain Eleanor's mysterious burden. Her findings revealed a society where women routinely suffered devastating losses in complete silence, forbidden by social convention from acknowledging or mourning deaths that occurred before birth or shortly thereafter. The enhanced digital images suggested that Eleanor had preserved physical evidence of such a loss, carrying it with her during the portrait session as a kind of memorial that could never be publicly acknowledged or properly mourned. The profound grief evident in her photographed expression suddenly took on new dimensions, representing not just the loss of a husband, but the earlier loss of a child whose existence had never been officially recorded. Further research into Millbrook's historical records revealed no documentation of Eleanor ever bearing children, though 19th-century record-keeping was often incomplete regarding pregnancies that did not result in living births. Dr. Reynolds discovered that many Victorian women suffered such losses repeatedly, without any official acknowledgement, creating invisible populations of mothers who grieved for children that society refused to recognize as having existed. Eleanor's subsequent behavior, her increasing isolation, and her obsessive relationship with the portrait suddenly seemed comprehensible as the response of a woman carrying unbearable grief for losses that could never be shared or socially acknowledged. The portrait had become not just a memorial to her husband, but a secret shrine to the child she could never publicly mourn. Dr. Reynolds faced an ethical dilemma that extended far beyond academic research protocols. Recognizing that her discovery had the potential to provide closure for a century-old mystery, while simultaneously exposing private grief that Eleanor had gone to extraordinary lengths to conceal. The question of whether such secrets should remain buried or be brought to light for the sake of historical understanding created sleepless nights and endless moral debates. After weeks of internal struggle, Dr. Reynolds decided to share her findings with the Historical Society's Board of Directors, presenting the enhanced digital images along with her research into Victorian mourning customs and medical practices. The revelation that Eleanor's portrait contained evidence of previously unknown personal tragedy transformed the board's understanding of both the woman and the photograph that had been their prized possession for decades. The board's initial response was one of fascinated horror, as respectable community leaders grappled with the implications of harboring such a disturbing artifact without having recognized its true nature. Several members argued for removing the portrait from public display to protect visitor sensibilities, while others insisted that its historical significance had actually been enhanced by Dr. Reynolds's discoveries. William Carpenter's grandson, now serving as the Society's president, cast the deciding vote to maintain the portrait in its place of honor, while adding explanatory material that would help visitors understand Eleanor's story, without sensationalizing the tragic circumstances of her loss. The decision reflected a mature recognition that history encompasses human experiences in all their complexity, including aspects that might make contemporary viewers uncomfortable. Dr. Reynolds prepared detailed documentation of her research and discoveries, creating a scholarly article that would introduce Eleanor's story to the broader academic community, while respecting the dignity of a woman who had suffered losses that 19th-century society was unprepared to acknowledge or address. Her work contributed to growing historical understanding of Victorian women's experiences and the hidden tragedies that shaped countless lives during that era. The portrait's reputation began to evolve as word of Dr. Reynolds's discoveries spread through academic circles and eventually reached the general public through carefully written newspaper articles and magazine features. Eleanor Whitmore transformed from an obscure historical footnote into a symbol of the hidden sufferings endured by countless women throughout history, her story resonating with modern audiences who could appreciate the courage required to carry such grief in absolute solitude. Visitors to the Historical Society began approaching Eleanor's portrait with new understanding and deeper empathy, recognizing that the composed expression they had previously interpreted as simple bereavement actually masked layers of loss and sorrow that had never been properly acknowledged. The photograph became a focal point for discussions about women's history, medical practices, and social conventions that had shaped previous generations in ways that modern society was only beginning to understand. The enhanced digital images, though disturbing in their implications, provided compelling evidence of human resilience and the lengths to which people will go to preserve connections with those they have loved and lost. Eleanor's decision to include such intimate evidence of her loss in a formal portrait demonstrated both desperation and courage, creating a permanent record of experiences that might otherwise have been forgotten entirely. Some visitors reported experiencing strong emotional reactions while viewing the portrait, particularly after learning about Dr. Reynolds's discoveries and understanding the true significance of Eleanor's carefully arranged pose. The combination of historical knowledge and visual evidence created powerful connections across time, allowing modern viewers to empathize with a woman whose experiences had been shaped by social conventions and medical limitations that no longer applied. Dr. Reynolds's research expanded beyond Eleanor's individual story to encompass broader investigations into 19th-century women's lives, revealing patterns of hidden grief and unacknowledged loss that had affected thousands of families throughout New England and beyond. Her work contributed to evolving historical understanding of how social conventions and medical limitations had shaped women's experiences in ways that were only becoming visible through modern research techniques. The portrait itself became a teaching tool for university students studying Victorian culture, women's history, and the evolution of photographic techniques. With Eleanor's story serving as a compelling example of how modern technology could reveal historical secrets that had remained hidden for more than a century. The combination of technical analysis and historical research demonstrated the power of interdisciplinary approaches to understanding the past. Eleanor's house on Elm Street, meanwhile, had passed through several owners since her death, with each successive resident reporting unusual incidents that seemed to center around the front parlor where the portrait had once unexplained sounds, temperature fluctuations, and occasional glimpses of a woman in black clothing became part of the property's informal history, though no connection was made to Eleanor's story until Dr. Reynolds's research brought her tragic circumstances to light. The current owner, a young couple who had purchased the house without knowledge of its history, contacted Dr. Reynolds after reading about Eleanor's story in a local newspaper article. They described experiences that seemed to echo Mrs. Thornton's century-old observations, including sounds of crying that seemed to come from within the walls themselves, and the persistent sensation of being watched by an invisible presence. Dr. Reynolds visited the house and confirmed that the front parlor retained its original architectural features, including the mantelpiece where Eleanor's portrait had been displayed during her lifetime. The room's atmosphere was noticeably different from the rest of the house, with a quality of expectant silence that seemed to await some kind of resolution or acknowledgement that had never arrived. The couple reported that their young daughter, too small to understand the house's history, consistently avoided the front parlor and became distressed when encouraged to play in that room. Her behavior suggested the kind of sensitivity to environmental factors that children sometimes display, possibly detecting subtle cues that adult senses miss entirely. Dr. Reynolds suggested that the couple might consider some form of acknowledgement or memorial for Eleanor and her loss, recognizing that unresolved grief sometimes required formal recognition before it could find peace. The suggestion was based partly on historical precedent and partly on intuitive understanding of the emotional forces that might persist when significant losses go unacknowledged for extended periods. The couple arranged for a small memorial service in Eleanor's honor, inviting members of the Historical Society and local clergy to acknowledge both her life and the losses she had endured in solitude. The ceremony was simple and respectful, focusing on Eleanor's dignity and courage, rather than sensationalizing the tragic circumstances that Dr. Reynolds's research had revealed. Following the memorial service, the unusual incidents in the house diminished significantly, suggesting that formal acknowledgement of Eleanor's story had provided some form of resolution for whatever forces had been maintaining her presence in the location where she had spent her final years. The change was gradual rather than dramatic, but unmistakable in its effect on the house's atmosphere and the family's comfort level. Dr. Reynolds continued her research into Victorian women's experiences, using Eleanor's story as a foundation for broader investigations into how social conventions and medical limitations had, quote, shaped countless lives during the 19th century. Her work contributed to growing academic recognition that women's history encompassed experiences that had been systematically ignored or suppressed by contemporary record-keeping practices. The portrait remained on display at the Historical Society, where it continued to attract visitors who were drawn by Eleanor's story and the remarkable circumstances of its modern interpretation. The combination of exceptional photographic artistry and hidden historical significance made it one of the most compelling artifacts in the Society's collection, demonstrating how modern technology could unlock secrets that had remained hidden for generations. Eleanor Whitmore's legacy evolved from that of an obscure Victorian widow into something far more significant, a symbol of the hidden tragedies that had shaped countless women's lives throughout history, and a reminder that individual human experiences often transcended the social conventions that attempted to define and limit them. Her courage in preserving evidence of her loss, even in the face of complete social isolation, provided inspiration for modern viewers who could appreciate the strength required to endure such grief in absolute solitude. The portrait itself became a window into a vanished world where women routinely suffered losses that society refused to acknowledge. Their grief transformed into private shrines that could never be shared or publicly mourned. Eleanor's decision to include such intimate evidence in her formal portrait demonstrated both the depth of her sorrow and her determination to create some form of permanent memorial for experiences that might otherwise have been forgotten entirely. As years passed, visitors to the Historical Society continued to discover new layers of meaning in Eleanor's photographed gaze, recognizing in her composed expression the kind of strength that women throughout history had been forced to develop in order to survive losses that their societies were unprepared to acknowledge or address. Her story resonated across generations, connecting modern viewers with experiences that transcended temporal boundaries and cultural differences. The technological advances that had revealed Eleanor's secret continued to evolve, and by the 21st century, even more sophisticated digital analysis techniques became available to researchers studying historical photographs. Dr. Reynolds, now an established authority on Victorian women's history, collaborated with computer imaging specialists to apply cutting-edge enhancement algorithms to Eleanor's portrait, revealing details that previous technology had been unable to detect. These latest enhancements confirmed her earlier discoveries, while providing additional information about the nature of Eleanor's burden and the circumstances surrounding the portrait's creation. The improved resolution revealed textile patterns and fabric textures that helped identify the materials Eleanor had used to preserve her precious memorial, while spectral analysis of the photographic emulsion provided insights into the chemical processes Jeremiah Blackwood had employed during development. The most startling revelation came when advanced pattern recognition software was applied to the enhanced images, revealing structural details that had been invisible even to Dr. Reynolds's careful analysis. Decades earlier, the technology identified anatomical features with such precision that medical consultants could estimate developmental stages and provide insights into the circumstances that had led to Eleanor's devastating loss. Dr. Sarah Martinez, a specialist in digital forensics who had been consulted on the analysis, found herself deeply moved by the technical evidence of Eleanor's grief. "What we're seeing here transcends simple historical documentation," she explained to a gathering of researchers and historians who had assembled to review the latest findings. This woman found a way to preserve the most intimate evidence of her loss using the limited resources available to her in 1899. Level of care and preservation involved suggests she understood that future technology might someday reveal what contemporary AIs could not detect. The implications of Dr. Martinez's observation extended far beyond academic research, suggesting that Eleanor had possessed remarkable foresight in recognizing that her secret might eventually be discoverable through technological advances she could not have imagined. The portrait thus became not just a memorial, but a deliberate message to future generations, a way of ensuring that her loss would someday be acknowledged and understood. This interpretation transformed Eleanor's story once again, elevating her from tragic victim to visionary communicator who had found a way to transcend the limitations of her historical moment. Her decision to include such intimate evidence in a formal portrait suddenly seemed less like desperate grief and more like calculated preservation, a scientific approach to ensuring that important information would survive for future discovery. Dr. Reynolds, now in her 70s, but still actively researching Victorian women's experiences, found this interpretation both compelling and emotionally satisfying. Eleanor's apparent foresight suggested a level of intelligence and planning that elevated her tragic story into something more empowering, a demonstration of how individual determination could overcome social constraints and temporal limitations. The enhanced analysis also revealed previously unnoticed details in other portions of the portrait, including subtle indicators in Eleanor's facial expression and body language that suggested she had been fully aware of the significance of what she was preserving. Her composed demeanor now seemed less like emotional repression and more like deliberate control, the behavior of someone who understood that she was creating historical evidence for future examination. These discoveries attracted attention from researchers worldwide, with Eleanor's portrait becoming a case study in the application of modern technology to historical analysis. Universities began using her story as an example of how interdisciplinary collaboration between historians, computer scientists, and medical specialists could unlock information that traditional research methods might never have revealed. The portrait's fame also attracted less scholarly attention, with paranormal investigators and ghost hunters expressing interest in the artifact that had been associated with unusual phenomena for more than a century. The Historical Society's board found themselves fielding requests from television producers and documentary filmmakers who wanted to explore the supernatural aspects of Eleanor's story alongside its historical significance. Dr. Reynolds resisted these commercial approaches, arguing that Eleanor's dignity required respectful treatment that focused on her human experience rather than sensationalizing the mysterious circumstances surrounding her life and death. Her protection of Eleanor's legacy reflected a personal investment that had developed over decades of research, transforming what had begun as academic curiosity into something approaching a sacred trust. The society ultimately decided to limit access to the portrait for filming purposes, while continuing to welcome serious researchers and genuinely interested visitors who approached Eleanor's story with appropriate respect. This policy balanced the need to protect the artifact with recognition of its broader cultural significance and educational value. Meanwhile, paranormal researchers conducted their own investigations of Eleanor's former home on Elm Street, documenting electromagnetic anomalies and temperature variations that seemed to center around the front parlor where the portrait had once hung. Their findings were consistent with Mrs. Thornton's century-old observations and the more recent experiences reported by current residents, suggesting that some form of energy or presence had maintained connection to the location across multiple generations. Dr. Amanda Foster, a psychologist specializing in grief counseling, became interested in Eleanor's story as an example of how unresolved loss could manifest across time and space. Her research into the psychological aspects of Eleanor's experience provided new insights into the relationship between individual trauma and environmental phenomena, suggesting that intense emotional energy might indeed persist in ways that conventional science was only beginning to understand. Eleanor's story demonstrates how powerful grief can become when it has no acceptable outlet, Dr. Foster explained during a conference presentation about historical trauma and its lasting effects. Her need to preserve evidence of her loss was so intense that it seems to have created a kind of temporal echo, a persistent presence that continues to seek acknowledgement more than a century after her death. This psychological interpretation resonated with visitors who had experienced their own losses, particularly women who had endured pregnancy loss or infant death in circumstances where social support was limited or unavailable. Eleanor's story provided a historical framework for understanding how such experiences had been handled throughout human history, offering both perspective and validation for contemporary grief. The portrait began attracting visitors who came specifically to pay respects to Eleanor and the child she had lost, transforming the historical society into an unexpected pilgrimage site for people seeking connection with experiences that transcended historical boundaries. The society's staff learned to recognize these special visitors and provided them with quiet space for reflection and remembrance. Some visitors reported profound emotional experiences while viewing the portrait, describing sensations of comfort or understanding that seemed to emanate from Eleanor's photographed presence. These accounts were carefully documented by Dr. Reynolds, who recognized their potential significance for understanding how historical artifacts could serve therapeutic functions for contemporary audiences. The cumulative effect of these experiences gradually transformed the historical society itself, evolving from a simple repository of local artifacts into something approaching a sacred space where past MLS and present intersected in meaningful ways. Staff members noted changes in the building's atmosphere that seemed to reflect growing recognition of Eleanor's story and its broader significance. The enhanced digital analysis had revealed one final detail that Dr. Reynolds initially hesitated to share publicly, recognizing its potential to fundamentally alter understanding of Eleanor's entire story. Deep within the folds of fabric that Eleanor clutched, the latest imaging technology had detected what appeared to be deliberate markings, possibly text or symbols that had been inscribed with materials that remained chemically active enough to register on spectral analysis equipment. The markings were too faint and fragmented to decipher with current technology, but their presence suggested that Eleanor had included written communication along with the physical evidence she had preserved. The possibility that she had left a deliberate message for future discovery added yet another layer to her already complex story, transforming her from historical subject into active communicator across temporal boundaries. Dr. Reynolds shared this discovery only with select colleagues who had demonstrated serious commitment to Eleanor's dignity and historical significance. Recognizing that premature revelation might attract unwanted attention from sensationalistic media outlets or commercial interests, the secret became a kind of sacred trust among researchers, who understood that Eleanor's final message deserved respectful treatment whenever technology advanced sufficiently to reveal its contents. The prospect that Eleanor might have left written explanation of her circumstances created new urgency around the development of imaging technologies capable of reading such faint inscriptions. Research grants were pursued specifically for the purpose of advancing spectral analysis techniques that might eventually unlock Eleanor's final communication, representing a unique collaboration between historical research and technological development. While waiting for such advances, Dr. Reynolds continued documenting visitor experiences and environmental phenomena associated with both the portrait and Eleanor's former home, building a comprehensive record that might help future researchers understand the full scope of Eleanor's legacy. Her meticulous documentation reflected decades of experience in recognizing that seemingly insignificant details often proved crucial for understanding complex historical situations. The portrait, meanwhile, continued its silent vigil in the Historical Society's main exhibition room, its sepia tones preserving not just Eleanor's image, but the evidence of love, loss, and determination that had shaped one woman's response to circumstances beyond her control. Visitors continued to discover new meanings in her composed expression and carefully arranged hands, each interpretation adding to the growing understanding of what it meant to be a woman carrying unbearable loss in a society that provided no acceptable outlet for such grief. Eleanor Whitmore's story had transcended its origins as local historical curiosity to become something far more significant, a bridge between past and present that illuminated experiences common to humanity across all temporal and cultural boundaries. Her portrait served as proof that individual human dignity could triumph over social limitation, that love could find ways to preserve itself despite overwhelming obstacles, and that truth would eventually emerge regardless of how carefully it had been concealed. The woman who had posed for what appeared to be a simple widow's portrait in 1899 had created something infinitely more complex and enduring, a testament to the power of human determination and the possibility that even the most carefully guarded secrets might someday find their way to understanding and acknowledgement. Her legacy continued to evolve with each new visitor who recognized in her photographed gaze the reflection of experiences that connected all human hearts across the vast distances of time and circumstance. In the end, Eleanor's portrait had become exactly what she had perhaps intended it to be, a permanent memorial not just to her own loss, but to all the hidden griefs that women throughout history had been forced to carry alone. A reminder that love transcends death, and that human dignity can survive even the most devastating circumstances when preserved with sufficient care and courage. The technological breakthrough that finally revealed Eleanor's hidden message came in 2023, when quantum imaging specialists at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology developed revolutionary spectral analysis techniques capable of detecting molecular-level inscriptions in historical Bach photographs. Dr. Jennifer Chen, leading the research team, had become fascinated with Eleanor's story after attending one of Dr. Reynolds's lectures about Victorian women's hidden histories. Recognizing that the portrait represented an ideal test case for their experimental technology, the process required transporting Eleanor's portrait to MIT's Advanced Imaging Laboratory, where it underwent the most sophisticated analysis ever applied to a 19th-century photograph. The quantum resonance scanners could detect chemical variations invisible to conventional equipment, revealing information preserved at the molecular level within the photographic emulsion that Jeremiah Blackwood had applied more than a century earlier. Dr. Chen's team worked with painstaking precision, understanding that they were potentially uncovering the final communication from a woman whose voice had been silenced by social convention and historical circumstance. The technology represented decades of development in quantum physics and computer science, yet its application to Eleanor's portrait felt like a sacred mission rather than merely scientific investigation. The first scans revealed the presence of deliberate markings, exactly where Dr. Reynolds had suspected, confirming that Eleanor had indeed included written communication alongside the physical evidence she had preserved. The markings appeared to have been created using materials that contained metallic compounds, possibly ink made from iron gall or other substances common in Victorian writing implements, which had maintained sufficient chemical integrity to register on quantum analysis equipment. As the imaging process continued over several days, individual letters and symbols began emerging from the enhanced spectral data, each character painstakingly reconstructed from chemical traces that had survived more than 120 years within the photograph's emulsion. Dr. Chen found herself holding her breath as Eleanor's words gradually materialized on computer screens, understanding that she was witnessing the emergence of a voice that had been waiting more than a century to be heard. The complete message, when finally reconstructed, proved to be both heartbreaking and illuminating, providing the context that researchers had sought for decades, while confirming the depth of Eleanor's foresight and intelligence. Written in Eleanor's careful script, the words had been inscribed with microscopic precision on silk threads that she had then incorporated into her memorial bundle, demonstrating remarkable ingenuity in finding ways to preserve information for future discovery. To those who find this message, Eleanor had written, "Know that I carried my beloved child through 37 weeks of hope before fever took us both to death's threshold. I alone returned, but could not bear to surrender the only physical proof of a life that brought such joy and promise. Society offers no recognition for such losses, no graves for those who never drew breath, no mourning period for grief that has no official acknowledgement. I preserve this evidence in hope that future generations will understand what we endured in silence, and perhaps find ways to honor losses that our time refuses to recognize. The child I carry in this portrait was to be named Victoria, after our queen, and though she never lived to see this world, she remains forever my daughter, and deserves to be remembered as such." The revelation of the child's intended name added profound personal dimension to Eleanor's story, transforming an abstract tragedy into the specific loss of Victoria Whitmore. a daughter who had existed long enough to be loved and planned for, but had never been granted official recognition or social acknowledgement. Eleanor's decision to preserve not just physical evidence, but also her daughter's chosen name, demonstrated her determination to ensure that Victoria would someday be remembered as a real person, rather than merely in reign. Unfortunate medical incident. Dr. Chen shared Eleanor's message with Dr. Reynolds, now 81 years old, but still sharp and deeply invested in Eleanor's story after 5 decades of research. The elderly historian wept openly upon reading Eleanor's words, recognizing that her life's work had culminated in giving voice to a woman whose suffering had been silenced by the social constraints of her era. Eleanor was right to trust that future technology would reveal her message, Dr. Reynolds said during the press conference announcing the discovery. She understood that truth has its own persistence, its own way of emerging when the time is right and the tools become available. Victoria Whitmore can finally be acknowledged as the real person she was, loved and mourned and remembered by a mother who refused to let social convention erase her daughter's existence. The revelation of Eleanor's message sparked intense discussion within academic circles about the responsibilities of historical research and the ethics of preserving individual privacy versus serving broader educational purposes. Some scholars argued that Eleanor's deliberate inclusion of the message indicated her desire for eventual discovery and acknowledgement, while others suggested that such intimate grief should remain private grace, regardless of technological capabilities. Dr. Martinez, the digital forensics specialist who had contributed to earlier analysis, supported publication of Eleanor's message as a service to contemporary women who continued to face similar losses without adequate social support or recognition. Eleanor's story provides historical validation for experiences that millions of women have endured throughout human history, she argued. Her voice can offer comfort and perspective to people dealing with comparable grief in our own time. The debate was resolved when the Millbrook Historical Society, in consultation with Eleanor's distant relatives who had been located through genealogical research, voted unanimously to share Eleanor's complete story, including her final message. The decision reflected growing recognition that historical understanding required acknowledgement of experiences that previous generations had been forced to suppress or ignore. Victoria Whitmore was formally memorialized during a ceremony held at Eleanor's gravesite, where a new marker was installed acknowledging both mother and daughter as members of the Millbrook community. The inscription read simply, Eleanor Whitmore, 1864 to 1903, loving mother to Victoria, remembered always. The ceremony attracted hundreds of participants, including many women who had experienced similar losses and found healing through Eleanor's example of preserving love despite social constraints. The enhanced understanding of Eleanor's story also shed new light on the unusual phenomena that had been reported around both the portrait and her former home throughout the decades. Dr. Foster, the grief counselor who had studied the psychological aspects of Eleanor's experience, proposed that the persistent environmental anomalies might represent Eleanor's continuing vigil over her daughter's memorial, a protective presence that would naturally diminish once Victoria's existence had been properly acknowledged. This interpretation proved remarkably accurate, as reports of unusual incidents decreased dramatically following the memorial ceremony and public recognition of Victoria's story. The current residents of Eleanor's former home noted a profound shift in the building's atmosphere, describing a sense of peaceful resolution that had been absent during the previous decades of mysterious occurrences. The portrait itself seemed to reflect this change, with visitors noting that Eleanor's expression appeared somehow softer and more peaceful when viewed with knowledge of her complete story. The psychological effect of understanding her true circumstances transformed the viewing experience from one of mysterious melancholy to one of profound empathy and respect for maternal love that had transcended temporal boundaries. Dr. Chen's quantum imaging technology, proven successful through its application to Eleanor's portrait, began attracting requests from museums and historical societies worldwide, seeking to unlock secrets hidden within their own photographic collections. The technique promised to revolutionize historical research by revealing information that conventional analysis had been unable to detect, opening new possibilities for understanding individual experiences within broader historical contexts. Eleanor's story became a foundational case study for this emerging field of quantum historical analysis, demonstrating how advanced technology could serve humanitarian purposes by giving voice to previously silenced experiences. Universities began developing curricula that combined quantum physics, computer science, and historical research, recognizing that interdisciplinary collaboration would be essential for unlocking the full potential of these new analytical techniques. The portrait's fame continued growing as Eleanor's complete story spread through academic publications, documentary films, and popular media accounts that treated her experience with appropriate dignity and respect. Visitors to the Millbrook Historical Society increased dramatically, with many coming specifically to pay respects to Eleanor and Victoria while learning about the broader historical context of women's experiences during the Victorian era. The Society expanded their exhibition space to accommodate growing interest in Eleanor's story, creating an entire room dedicated to exploring themes of grief, loss, and social constraints that had shaped women's lives throughout American history. Eleanor's portrait remained the centerpiece of this expanded exhibition, but now it was surrounded by context that helped visitors understand her experience as part of broader patterns affecting countless families. Educational programs developed around Eleanor's story proved particularly effective in helping contemporary audiences understand how social attitudes toward pregnancy loss had evolved over time. High school students studying women's history found her experience both shocking and illuminating, recognizing that social progress often involved acknowledging experiences that previous generations had been forced to endure in silence. Medical professionals also found value in Eleanor's story as a historical example of how societal attitudes could compound the trauma of pregnancy loss by denying grieving mothers appropriate support. Recognition. Her experience provided powerful illustration of why modern medical practice emphasized acknowledgement and memorial services for losses that previous eras had treated as non-events, requiring no emotional processing. The psychological impact of Eleanor's story extended beyond academic or professional contexts, reaching individuals who had experienced similar losses and found comfort in her example of preserving love despite overwhelming social pressure to forget and move forward. Support groups for pregnancy loss began incorporating Eleanor's story into their discussions, using her courage as inspiration for their own healing processes. Letters and emails arrived at the Historical Society from around the world, written by people who felt personal connection to Eleanor's experience and wanted to express gratitude for her courage in preserving evidence that would eventually provide validation for their own grief. These communications demonstrated how individual historical experiences could transcend cultural and temporal boundaries to offer meaning and comfort across vast distances of time and space. Dr. Reynolds, now recognized as the world's leading authority on Eleanor's story, continued receiving invitations to speak at conferences and universities, where her research had influenced understanding of Victorian women's experiences. Her presentations always emphasized Eleanor's intelligence and determination, portraying her not as a victim of circumstances, but as a woman who had found ways to triumph over social limitations through careful planning and remarkable foresight. The quantum imaging analysis had also revealed additional details about Jeremiah Blackwood's photographic techniques, providing new insights into 19th-century studio practices and chemical processes. Photography historians found these technical discoveries almost as fascinating as Eleanor's personal story, recognizing that her portrait represented a unique convergence of artistic skill, technological capability, and human determination that had preserved information across more than a century. Blackwood's descendants, located through genealogical research similar to that which had identified Eleanor's relatives, expressed pride in their ancestors' unwitting role in preserving such an important historical document. They donated additional examples of his work to the Historical Society, creating a more complete picture of 19th-century photography in rural New England communities. The portrait's significance continued expanding as researchers applied increasingly sophisticated analytical techniques to extract every possible detail from the original image. Each new technological advance revealed additional information, confirming Eleanor's wisdom in choosing photography as her method of preservation and demonstrating the remarkable durability of properly processed raya photographic materials. Contemporary artists began creating works inspired by Eleanor's story, exploring themes of hidden grief, social constraint, and the persistence of love across temporal boundaries. These artistic interpretations helped introduce Eleanor's experience to audiences who might not typically visit historical museums, spreading awareness of her story through galleries, performance spaces, and digital media platforms. The growing cultural impact of Eleanor's story reflected broader changes in social attitudes toward pregnancy loss. With her historical experience providing context for contemporary discussions about grief, memorial practices, and the importance of acknowledging losses that had previously been minimized or ignored. Her courage in preserving evidence of Victoria's existence had contributed to evolving understanding of how such experiences should be recognized and supported. As the 21st century progressed, Eleanor's portrait continued serving its original purpose as a memorial, while simultaneously functioning as an educational tool, a work of art, and a symbol of human resilience that transcended the specific circumstances of its creation. The woman who had posed in Jeremiah Blackwood's studio in 1899 had succeeded beyond her wildest dreams in ensuring that her daughter would be remembered and that their story would provide meaning and comfort to future generations facing similar challenges. Victoria Whitmore, the child who had never lived to see the world beyond her mother's womb, had finally received the recognition and remembrance that Eleanor had fought so desperately to preserve. Their story stood as testament to the power of maternal love, the importance of historical truth, and the possibility that individual determination could overcome even the most overwhelming social obstacles when guided by sufficient courage and remarkable foresight.